Hello and welcome to Bedhead Books. Today we are going to be talking about Don't Look Back in Anger by Daniel Rachel. This is the rise and fall of Cool Britannia told by those who were there. So what we called Cool Britannia was the UK in the 1990s, the emergence of britpop and the rise of Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Elastica, Suede, you name it. Rachel also extends the reach of the book out into the art community, so the founding of the Tate Modern, Tracey Emin, Matt Collishaw, people like that. The film industry with Danny Boyle and Gurinder Chadha. We have the publishing industry with Irving Welsh and Nick Hornby, and of course the fact that their books were adapted for film. The TV comedy industry is also mentioned, so we got contributions from David Deal, Steve Coogan. A whole host of 90s British icons are in here. Rachel was active in a band in the 1990s. They were called Rachel's Basement. They independently released a couple of albums, and Rachel actually shared a flat with Simon Fowler, who was lead singer of the Ocean Colour scene. So the story begins in 80s Britain under Margaret Thatcher. Very unpopular figure, but there is some credit given to her by a couple of people in the book, including Tracey Emin, because Thatcher was about this whole entrepreneurial spirit and this whole there's no such thing as society, only individuals, and you know, it's every man for himself kind of thing. She is credited to some extent with giving people the funding or the impetus to take it upon themselves to control their own destiny and their own direction. And while there is absolutely no shortage of people who still hate Margaret Thatcher, there is something to be said, I think, for everyone who we may view as a negative person, still having an influence on our lives. From there, we move on to The Second Summer of Love in 1988, the arrival of ecstasy, rave culture, and although the youth of the UK were out and about, enjoying DJ performances, going to clubs, they still wanted music that they could listen to at home, guitar-oriented music that spoke to them. And this is how we got bands like the Happy Mondays, the Stone Roses, Primal Scream, all these bands who kind of produced a hybrid between dance and rock. And Rachel also credits this with providing some of the optimism and the community spirit that is evident particularly in the songs of Oasis, that big sing-along laddish part of their repertoire. Music does play the biggest role in this book, but the second biggest role is actually taken by the politics of the time. We've got interviews in this book from John Major, we've got interviews in this book from Tony Blair, and because of that we've obviously got a few other people from the Tories and from Labour giving us a flavour of what was happening with them at the times and the rise of Cool Britannia and how this coincided with the rise of what they were referring to as New Labour, and how the two intersected with each other. Blair was seen at rock gigs. He obviously had a background, he'd been in a band at university, and he'd held parties at Number 10 where he invited people such as Noel Gallagher, Alan McGee, who was the owner of Creation Records, Oasis's label. This perhaps gave us the enthusiasm that we could really affect the political landscape. But it was also met with cynicism that does still exist, coming from Albarn and Jarvis Cocker in here, who say that, that there's an element of politicians using famous people to get into power, to get their message across. An observation I think I would make is that in popular culture now, a lot of artists and bands tend to be aligned with individual causes, such as the LGBT community, big tragedies such as the Manchester bombings, rather than being too much involved in a political party. And as I say, this is to do with the optimism of the time and the view that we could affect change. And whatever we might think of politicians, I can imagine it being difficult. On the numerous occasions Blair is interviewed in the book, you can really pick up on his anxieties and his insecurities and how he was scared by a lot of things that he had to deal with once in power, but I think anybody would be. And he had to deal with two massive things which are acknowledged in this book as being a significant factor in Britpop's downfall, this being the death of Princess Diana in 1997 and 9/11 in 2001. So the national mood was obviously affected by the death of Diana, so many people feeling that they could identify with her more than any other royal. And 9/11, of course, was a massive shock to everybody, and did send the message of we're not safe anymore, we're not really progressing anymore, and we're not getting to this multicultural environment. Because there are people interviewed for this book such as Meera Syal, Tajinder Singh, lead singer of Corner Shop, Sonia Madan, lead singer of Echo Berry, Gurinder Chadha, film director who directed Bend It Like Beckham, and they were all part of British culture in the 90s, and the breaking down of those barriers between British people and Asian people, all that was kind of suddenly lost by the mistrust that was created by 9/11. So you'll notice I'm talking about the interviews quite a lot. So this book is a series of interviews and recollections from 68 people who were present in Cool Britannia. There's a little bit from Rachel at the front, but apart from that, he has compiled all of these interviews that he's conducted for the book. Now, this is the third book I've reviewed on this channel that takes this interview-driven approach, the other two being The Invisible Man by Jed Pittman and The Second Summer of Love by Alan Shulman. Of the three books, I think this one does fall in the middle. I think Alan Shulman does take the approach a little bit better, purely because it's that balance between his own perspective and the interviews. But to an extent, I may very well have been expecting this, given I have read one of Rachel's previous books, which is also made up of interviews. It's an interview book with the legendary UK songwriters. It's called Isle of Noises, and he talks to Ray Davies, Robin Gibb, Johnny Marr, Noel Gallagher, all sorts of people. If you've not read it, I'd recommend that book too. But this book does handle the formula better, I think, than Pittman's book, but not quite as good as Shulman's. I do think it's an excellent companion to Second Summer of Love, because Second Summer of Love is about Britain in the 1980s. This is Britain in the 1990s. And so for that reason, I am going to give Don't Look Back in Anger an 8 out of 10. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, don't judge this book by its cover.
Gonna start a revolution from my bed. She said the brains I had went to my head. Step outside, the summertime's in bloom. Stand up beside the fireplace. Take that look from off your face. 'Cause you ain't ever gonna burn my heart out. So